All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today we're tackling a question that almost sounds like it's straight out of like some kind of sci-fi thriller, right? Forget about tanks and nukes for a second. Could tech companies, I mean like the big ones, really become the next superpowers? Like, could they actually surpass entire nations? It's a pretty wild thought, but we're going to be diving into some seriously interesting excerpts, all about this whole idea of digital world order. And how it, might just completely change everything we think we know about global power.
Yeah, this is a question that's definitely got everyone talking in the world of geopolitics. After the Cold War, the U.S. was really the only superpower, right? But the source we're looking at, it argues that the U.S. hasn't really been that successful in getting the world to, follow its lead.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not like everyone just like fell in line. And the source gives some pretty concrete examples too, like Russia kind of doing its own thing outside of like Western influence. And of course,
Yeah.
you've got China's economy like exploding and even problems within the US itself. It really paints this picture of power becoming a lot more, multipolar, with influence spread out across different countries
Yeah.
and, wait for it, entities.
Exactly. And the source, it goes even deeper and breaks down this power into what it calls three axes. So we have the, traditional security order, the economic order, and then this new, like, really interesting dimension, the digital order. It's almost like, three-dimensional chess where the rules are constantly changing.
All right, I'm already hooked. Let's start with security. I mean, everyone knows that the U.S. still has, the biggest military, but I was really surprised by this one detail about the U.S. Marine Corps. So apparently they've got this plan for 2030 to basically become this, like, super mobile force that's specifically designed to control the South and East China Seas. I mean, what does that even mean for China's ambitions in their region? Like, is it just a show of force or is there something bigger happening here?
Oh, it's definitely a strategic move and a pretty bold one at that.
Yeah.
You have to keep in mind that China has been putting a lot of effort into modernizing their military,
Yeah.
but the source points out that they're still, technologically behind the U.S. This 2030 plan could be a way for the U.S. to kind of get ahead of China's growing power in those, like, really important waterways. But it does raise the question, though, in today's world, is military strength really enough?
Right. It's not like, it was back in the Cold War days. Things are way more interconnected now. Look at what's happening with Russia, for example. Their military image has taken a pretty big hit with this whole Ukraine situation. And the source, it even says they've lost a ton of their fighting force. It really makes you think, like, is just having a huge military enough to make you a superpower anymore?
Yeah, it's becoming less about just raw military power and more about this, like, complex mix of factors.
Yeah.
Economic influence, being good with technology, even controlling information. Those things are becoming just as important as having a strong military, maybe even more important.
Which leads us to that second axis of power, right? The economic order. It's kind of crazy how closely tied the US and Chinese economies are, even with all the political stuff going on. It's like they're frenemies who need each other but can't stand each other at the same time.
Yeah, it's a textbook example of how economies can be, like, totally interdependent. They need each other, but they're also constantly fighting for power. And it's not just a two-player game anymore either. The source points out that other major players are emerging, like the EU. There's even talk of an EU Middle East India economic corridor, which would be a direct challenge to China's huge Belt and Road initiative.
Oh, yeah, things are getting crowded at the top. The source also goes into how the US has been using economic tools for political purposes, like putting controls on those semiconductor exports to try and slow down China's tech development, or even that whole potential TikTok ban because of data security worries. But aren't those risky moves? Could they end up hurting the US economy in the long run?
Oh, absolutely. There's always a chance of things backfiring. It just shows how much economics and politics are intertwined on a global scale.
Yeah.
Every action has a ripple effect. And the source makes a good point about the potential for unintended consequences.
Okay, so we've got military muscle and economic power, but now we're entering this really uncharted territory, this digital world order. This is where the source's argument about tech companies becoming superpowers starts to sound less like sci-fi and more like, actual reality. They're not just these neutral platforms anymore.
Right, it's a fundamental shift. Just think about the role that tech companies played in the war between Russia and Ukraine. They provided essential communication tools, helped Ukraine defend against those cyber attacks, and even limited their services in Russia. The source even suggests that these actions might have actually tipped the scales in the conflict.
Wow, it's like we're watching a real-life sci-fi movie unfold, right? Tech companies are becoming these major players on the world stage. But it goes beyond just war, right? These platforms have also been behind social and political movements all over the world, like the Arab Spring and the protests in Hong Kong. You can't deny the impact they have on how people organize and communicate.
And that brings up the whole tricky issue of their influence on elections and democracy. Remember that Cambridge Analytica scandal? They gathered data from millions of Facebook users to target them with political ads. And then you've got those Russian troll farms spreading misinformation to try and sway public opinion. It's all pretty unsettling.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder if we're giving these tech giants too much power. I mean, the source goes as far as to say that they could eventually become more powerful than national governments and basically become the main force shaping our world. Is that even possible? Could we really end up in a future where algorithms are in control?
Well, it might not be as crazy as it sounds. These companies, they already have a ton of power, and it's only growing. The source lays out three possible scenarios for how this whole digital world order thing could play out. And some of them are pretty interesting, while others are, well, a little bit scary.
All right, hit me with it. I'm ready for some mind-blowing scenarios.
Okay, so the first scenario, the source calls it a digital Cold War.
Hmm.
Picture this. A world where countries pick sides and align themselves with specific tech giants, almost like back in the day with the US and the Soviet Union. You'd have Google versus Tencent, Amazon versus Alibaba, each with their own set of rules, their own internet, their own digital currency, maybe even their own version of reality.
Whoa, that's intense. So instead of like physical borders, we'd have these digital walls dividing us. Talk about a fragmented world. Okay, so what's the alternative? What's scenario number two?
All right, so scenario two is a bit more hopeful. It imagines a world where the digital and physical worlds kind of manage to coexist, even if it's a bit of a, uneasy relationship. They'd operate separately, but still be locked in this, like, constant competition. Think of it like two separate ecosystems, each with its own rules and power dynamics. Governments would focus on the traditional stuff, security, diplomacy, that kind of thing. While tech companies would control the digital realm, pushing the boundaries of innovation and shaping our online lives.
So a kind of separate but equal situation, huh? Sounds like there would still be a lot of tension and conflict, though, right? Like, who gets to make the rules? Who's in charge when those two worlds inevitably clash?
You got it. There would definitely be this constant back and forth, each side trying to assert their dominance. Think about all those fights we're already seeing over data privacy, censorship online, and antitrust laws. That's just a small taste of what this kind of power struggle could look like on a global scale.
Okay, yeah, that's pretty intense. But then there's that third scenario, right? The one where the tech companies basically take over and become the new rulers. I mean, it's kind of scary, but also kind of fascinating. What would a world run by algorithms even look like?
Well, it's definitely the most radical of the three scenarios, but it's gaining some serious traction. Some people are even saying this is exactly where we're headed towards a technocracy. A world where these giant tech companies, with all their resources and technological know-how, basically replace governments. They control everything: communication, finance, healthcare, even education.
So it's like these mega corporations become like digital nation states. It's giving me serious dystopian vibes. But it also makes you think, I mean, if they're already influencing elections and shaping public opinion, is it really that much of a jump for them to actually be running things?
That's a good question. The source does acknowledge that there are some real concerns about putting so much power in the hands of just a few companies. These companies are already experts at swaying public opinion, finding loopholes to avoid taxes, and even, as you said, influencing elections. Now imagine what would happen if they were actually calling all the shots.
Yeah, it's a lot to wrap your head around. A digital Cold War, an uneasy coexistence, or a full-blown technocracy, I have to ask. Which scenario do you think is most likely to happen? And what does it all mean for us, the everyday people caught in the middle of this massive power shift?
Honestly, it's impossible to say for sure. The future is always unpredictable, especially when you're dealing with something as fast-moving as technology. The important thing is that we're aware of the possibilities and start asking the tough questions. Are we okay with how much power these companies already have?
Hmm.
What kind of safeguards do we need to put in place to make sure they're held accountable?
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to process. But I totally agree. We can't just sit back and passively watch this all happen. We have to stay informed, stay engaged, and maybe even be a little skeptical.
Exactly, and that brings us back to that big question the source was wrestling with. What happens if these tech companies actually do become the new superpowers? What responsibilities do they have to the world? We elect our governments, so we at least have some say in how they operate. But with corporations, well, it's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, that's the real issue, isn't it? How do we hold these tech giants accountable if they're the ones making all the rules?
The source doesn't really go into too much detail about that. But it's definitely the elephant in the room. We're so used to nation states being the main players on the world stage. But what happens when corporations, driven by profit and algorithms, start calling the shots? It's uncharted territory.
I mean, just think about it. What if your access to healthcare, education, even basic necessities was all decided by some algorithm controlled by a tech company? It sounds like something out of a dystopian novel, but could it actually happen?
Well, it's a slippery slope, that's for sure. We're already seeing the early stages of this with how these companies collect and use our data. They know our habits, our preferences, even our weaknesses better than we do. And they're using that information to influence our behavior, our choices, even our beliefs.
And who's to say they won't abuse that power? We've seen corporations put profits ahead of people time and time again. Why would it be any different if they became the new superpowers?
That's exactly why this conversation is so important. We need to start thinking seriously about how to hold these companies accountable. Do we need new laws, new international agreements, maybe even entirely new systems of global governance? These are tough questions, but we can't afford to ignore them.
Maybe we need to stop thinking of these companies as just neutral platforms and start seeing them for what they really are: powerful entities that can shape the course of history.
Exactly. We need to be more discerning, more critical, more demanding. We need to hold their feet to the fire and make sure they're using their power responsibly, ethically, and for the good of humanity, not just for their own bottom line.
Well said. I feel like we've really gone down a rabbit hole today, exploring this shifting landscape of global power, the rise of these tech giants, and all the possible futures that lie ahead. It's a lot to take in, but I hope it's left you feeling informed, engaged, and maybe even a little empowered.
It's definitely been a fascinating journey, and honestly, we've only just scratched the surface. The world's changing faster than ever, and it's up to all of us to stay informed, stay engaged, and make our voices heard.
Absolutely. And remember, this isn't just some abstract debate. These issues have real-world consequences that affect all of us. So keep exploring, keep questioning, keep pushing for a better future. Who knows, maybe you'll be the one to come up with the solutions that shape the next world order.
Now that's a thought-provoking challenge to leave our listeners with. Until next time, keep diving deep.
Yeah, it's a wild thought, isn't it? That maybe it won't be nations calling the shots, but these giant tech companies.
Right. It really makes you rethink how the world works. We're so used to thinking about like countries and borders, those old power structures.
But this digital world, it plays by a different set of rules, right? It's global, everything's connected, always changing.
Absolutely.
And remember that U.S. Marine Corps plan we were talking about earlier? The one for 2030? It's not just about showing military strength in the South China Sea. It's about controlling the digital space, too.
Oh, right.
They're talking about using AI, drones, all this advanced tech to basically like dominate the information landscape.
It's the perfect example of how the lines are getting blurry between the physical and digital.
Yeah.
And it really highlights that challenge we're facing. How do we even start to regulate or control these companies? Their operations are everywhere. Their influence is so widespread.
It feels like we're always a step behind, all our systems of government, the laws, the regulations, they were all made for a different time. They just don't seem equipped to deal with these tech giants and the challenges they bring.
We need to be thinking differently outside the box.
Right.
Maybe we need completely new international agreements, ones specifically designed for this digital world order.
Yeah.
Or maybe we need to give more power to organizations like the United Nations. Let them take a bigger role in regulating what these companies do.
It makes you wonder if we need to rethink the whole idea of democracy in this digital age, too. I mean, voting every few years seems kind of old-fashioned when you think about the constant real-time influence these companies have on our lives.
It is kind of a fundamental question. How do we make sure that people have a real voice in shaping this digital world order?
Yeah.
Maybe we need to explore new forms of democracy, digital democracy. Find ways for people to directly participate in making the decisions that affect their online lives.
This whole deep dive has really been eye-opening. The future of global power is clearly going to be shaped by technology, and these tech companies are right at the center of it all.
For sure.
But it's up to us to make sure that this power is used responsibly for the good of everyone, not just a select few.
That's a really great point to end on. The future isn't set in stone,
Yeah.
It's shaped by the choices we make today. So Let's stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This has been a truly mind-blowing journey into the heart of the digital world order. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some things to think about. Remember, the future is in our hands.